I want to talk to you just for a moment about the work of Dr. Charles Thomas's grandfather, Edgar Cayce. And again, the annual membership is less than it costs for two people to have the buffet dinner. They are often a tremendous discount. It includes a magazine, excellent discounts, but more importantly, it connects you to a soul family. And there is an absolute connection. And when you become part of that, you feel it. When you get involved in the webinars, when you attend these events, it is a reconnection with the law of one of Atlantis. And we are the ones that are going to carry forth to create that new world. Many people think that the Lemurians were the highest spiritual level that was ever reached on the earth. Edgar Cayce said in a reading that the law of one of Atlantis achieved the highest level of spirituality on the earth, and that is our family. And so I want to ask you to rejoin the family. We still have space, we still have room in our goals, and so how many of you that have not joined still plan to join the ARE? If you'll raise your hand. If you'll go in there right now and sign up, we'll wait for you to come back. So what I'd like to do before the introduction, tone the yam very lightly, please. Eyes closed. Now just for a moment, visualize highest good in the world. Visualize highest good in the earth. Visualize peace. And there is an energy attached to this. World peace, highest good for mankind. And now devote the thought to the people that have the courage to fight the old energy, because much of what is happening now is about old versus new. So let's give support to people like Graham Hancock. Visualize this man and put light around him. People like Dr. Robert Schoch, who are walking that tightrope and providing information that is important to you, because it's important for these people to remain in the academic side, because they're providing the information that helps us know our true history. So provide that light to Dr. Robert Schoch, to Graham Hancock, to Dr. Charles Thomas Cayce and John Van Auken of the ARE, who are bringing forth that information. Rejoin and collect with that family, because it is through collective high-minded thought, it is through the aggressiveness of theta creation that we will change the world. You will not end war by hating war. You will end war by loving peace, but you have to aggressively create that peace. in the way of Mahatma Gandhi. Thank you. And so now I would like to introduce a man that I had the honor to meet about 2 years ago. He invited me to his home for dinner with he and his beautiful wife, Leslie, and we felt immediately welcomed. We felt an immediate acceptance and a love. And I was very honored to see a table in Dr. Cayce's house that was built by his grandfather, Edgar. And he made a very special phone call to me on Easter Sunday. And it was a powerful day because Ann had been sent to the hospital in the emergency room where she was in intensive care for 6 days, just last month. And it was Easter Sunday, and he read to me a passage, a reading given by Edgar Cayce that described the Last Supper, that described what Jesus the Christ looked like and the men sitting next to him. And I'm very grateful for that. That meant so much to me, and I am honored for that. And I am honored to be associated with the work, because the work of Edgar Cayce changed my life. On the banks of the Amazon River, I read that book, and I have had a gratitude to this man ever since. I grew up in the Baptist Church of Arkansas, and on the banks of the Amazon River, I found my true truth. And it was through the Association for Research and Enlightenment. And I want to make a clarification. The ARE, the Edgar Cayce reading, is new energy. It is applicable. It is the most important and the most credible organization in metaphysics today. It is a wealth of scientific information, of health information, and most importantly, perhaps, of spiritual information. Please join. Please join our family together so that we can make the better world. A round of applause for Dr. Charles Thomas Cayce.
Well, do you think James had a past life? Lots of compliments and just an amazing of new members. Thank you, James. I don't know if I've ever been at an ARE program, or anyway. Thank you, you for having us here, Leslie and my wife, inviting us. It's been like being home, coming home, especially because of the frequent mentions of the work of Edgar Cayce. James, and this morning meditation on the mountains, just beautiful. The talks today, John and I both live in Virginia Beach. I was telling some folks I hadn't heard him speak in a couple of years. Had to come to Denver to hear my colleague talk, and that was terrific. Thank you again, James, for having us. I asked James what he would like me to talk about, and he said, you choose. I felt a little like a mosquito in a nudist colony. Lots of available material. The available material being the material in the Cayce readings, and sort of what to choose, where to choose. And this is a little bit of a new direction, new kind of presentation for me, maybe sort of going from the sublime to the mundane, because this is what I'd like to do with you. As you may have seen on our schedule, there are 3 perspectives that are often taken as one approaches the life and work of Edgar Cayce. At least that's been my experience. Often people want, not necessarily in this order of priority, but people often want some sense of understanding of who the man was. What was he like? Did he live in a cave somewhere, or what was he really like? Stories about how often he read the Bible and this and that. Well, what was he like? So the man. And then, of course, there are often questions, and we all still have those questions, or at least most of us who are familiar with this material, questions about the process, his psychic ability. Why did he have it? How did it work? What was the depth and breadth of it? My background is as a child psychologist. I was trained in graduate programs which, to a large extent, still today, do not accept the possibility of psychic ability. Even the term makes the majority of psychologists nervous today because it contradicts physical law as many people have currently understood it for many years. So there are questions and nervousness and excitement about the process itself. And then third, of course, there is the content of the readings themselves. And as you well know, there have been many books written about all three aspects of this man's life and work. Who the man was, the biographies, a number of biographies, and psychic ability, books about that, not only with regard to Edgar Cayce, but others with psychic ability, lots written on that subject. And then lots of books and materials on the content of the Cayce readings, whether it's Atlantis or specific physical ailments or whatever. So I was thinking what might be interesting and helpful to you this weekend from me, especially from me, with all of those books and speakers and things that you've heard and read about this man and his work, or maybe just a little about this man and his work. And I thought maybe I would try to bring a little bit of my unique perspective to you. Unique in this case. Many of you know there were about 2,000 of what James and John yesterday and today talked about as the life readings that Edgar Cayce gave, where people of all ages asked him, about 2,000 people, essentially, how can I live a happy, fulfilling life? Asked that in lots of different ways. And typically some past lifetimes were described, almost always, and so forth and so forth. There were those life readings. There are fewer than 60 of those people still alive, and we lose a few each year. I was one of those people. We haven't lost me yet, and I'm here to talk with you a little about that material, about my life reading. Let me say quickly, I have no memory of my grandfather. I was almost 3 when he died, so all that I have are stories that I've heard, experiences with my father and our family, and really thousands and thousands of hours with people who were his closest friends and the people that he worked with most closely. The strong ladies that were a part of his prayer group, Gladys, his secretary, of course, his 2 sons, my father, Hugh Lynn, and his younger brother, and so forth. Thousands and thousands of hours. I was telling my wife last night as I was looking over some notes, ready to talk with you, as we often do, boy, I wish I had focused more. I have notes, lots of notes as I talked with them as they got older and as I realized that it was important to talk with them about their experiences with Edgar Cayce. But I wish I had done more with that. But I'm not sure there's anybody alive who has more hours, more time with the people who were closest to him. And so I'd like to try to share a little bit of that with you, both in terms of a little from my expertise as a child psychologist, tell you a few personal stories, also as a student of the Cayce readings for most of my adult life. So let me just jump right in there. We have 2 days. If I don't get started in a hurry, it'll be supper time, and we'll have 1 day. And I'm going to cover these 3 focuses: the man, the process of psychic ability, and his work over these 2 days. We'll start into it today. We will certainly cover the man and get into the process, and I'm going to try to stop in time today for us to take a few minutes of questions right at the end. My wife has agreed to run around with the portable mic, and so you can be thinking of questions now, not just related to what I've said, but stories you've heard that I can try to embellish upon, or whatever you'd like. And we have John here, I think, and we have a number of people who are students of the Cayce readings, and so maybe between a bunch of us we can come up with answers to some of your questions. We'll do that today, then we will continue this process tomorrow afternoon. But I really need to start by telling you a quick little story unrelated to the topic today. We are in Embassy Suites, and I've given lots and lots of lectures, but I'm a little nervous today, not just because this is sort of a new approach in my talks, but because we're in Embassy Suites. And let me try to tell you this story quickly. Many years ago, I was scheduled to talk at a hotel all day long on Saturday in New York City. And I had appointments in Virginia Beach during the day on Friday, took a late flight up to New York City Friday night. It was spring, many years ago, this time of year, about a month earlier, and it was the weekend of my wife's birthday. I had a reservation at an Embassy Suites, and there were more stories than this, maybe 10 stories or something like that. And New York City makes me nervous anyway. Big city and that energy. We live on a little farm, Virginia Beach and so forth. Anyway, got in there, and they told me at the airport in New York there was a local transit strike going on in New York City. All of the public transportation was on strike. There were a number of the cab drivers who were also supporting the strike. So it was going to be a mess. I don't remember exactly how. I got into the hotel from the airport, found a cab or something, and the lobby of the Embassy Suites was chaos. There had been many commuters from outside the city who had come into the city for the week and had stayed in the city because they couldn't get back in and out on the subways and buses or trains or whatever. So the lobby was full of suitcases, people checking out of their rooms, going home outside of the city for the weekend and so forth. I got up to the lobby desk and announced my reservation, and they were frantic and so forth, checking people out and so on. They found my reservation and they said, well, we have your room ready, Dr. Cayce, but we don't have a key for your room. It's confusion here. We will send a bellman up with you and let you in the room, and in an hour or so we'll let you know we have a key and we'll bring it up to your room and so forth. So I went up, and it was now, I don't know what, 7 o'clock at night or something like that, and I just stayed right in the room. I brought a sandwich from home. But it was my wife's birthday that weekend, and she's here, so she knows this. I can admit this. The week before, I was traveling a great deal at that time in my life, and the year before, I had been away on her birthday and had forgotten to call her. And so it was absolutely an affirmation on my mind as I rode to New York on the plane, went into the hotel and into my room. I need to call Leslie and wish her a happy birthday. It was the next day, on Saturday. So I said, I'm going to wait and call her tomorrow. And nobody brought a key that night. I didn't try to get out of the room. It was not obviously this kind of key. This was many years ago. I don't remember what kind of key it was. But anyway, you needed a key that worked. I stayed in the room, woke up early the next morning, slept that night, I got up very early in the morning, got up early there, jumped out of bed, ran into the bathroom to take a shower, had on just my boxer shorts that I'd slept in, turned on the shower, and remembered Leslie's birthday. Ran back out and said to myself, I need to call her right now. And left the shower running, then ran back in, turned the shower off, sat down beside the bed, started to call the number, and there was a loud like that on the door, on the hotel door. And I was already New York City, big city, nervous, you know, farm boy. And I went to the little hole in the door and peeked out, nothing, you know. They had the chains, all the chains on the door. I opened the door with the chains still on and saw outside the door the morning paper. It was lying right out there. And I saw through the chains. So I took the chains off of the door and opened the door to pick up the paper. Now, I didn't have on just any undershorts. I had on a pair of boxer shorts, light yellow, as I recall, that were so thin they were see-through. My wife had tried, but they were so comfortable, so soft. My wife had tried to throw them away a number of times. I had retrieved them, and as a joke, she had, with the sewing machine, sewed abstract designs and a heart and so forth with red and black thread all over these shorts. So I stepped out of the door to pick up the paper. The door had one of these things like that on the back of it. As I bent over, the door tapped me on the butt and locked shut with me out in the hall at 5 in the morning and so forth. I ran down the hall. This is going to be quick. I need to finish it. Ran down the hall. Usually there's a phone outside the elevator. There was not a phone outside the elevator. Really, I'm beginning to perspire just telling. I hadn't told this story in many years. But it's 5 o'clock in the morning, you know. I pushed the elevator button, used all of my psychic ability to when the elevator came up empty, I was up whatever it was, 10 floors, 12 floors, willed it straight down without stopping, you know, to the lobby, hopefully would be empty. It went down one floor, and this guy gets on in his three-piece suit with his briefcase. I am huddled in the back of the elevator, you know, in my see-through boxer shorts with red thread all over them. Oh, what a mess, you know. The guy didn't even, you know, it's New York City. He didn't even start, you know. He looked straight ahead. And then in a moment, it sort of dawned on him or something. He said a question that I won't repeat to you. And I told him quickly what had happened, and he smiled, and I asked him to get off the elevator and go to the desk when we got down and got the bellman to come in and so forth, and got back up there and called my wife in the room and had a good story for my wife. And then told the story. I don't know if I've told it, but I told it to the group that I was speaking to in New York City that day. And at the break, a woman in the audience went and bought a new pair of bright blue boxer shorts and had stuck the New York bumper sticker on the butt, "I love New York," and presented those to me at the thing. Anyway, it is wonderful to be at the Embassy Suites with my wife, Leslie, this time, even though it's not her birthday. All right. Seriously, Edgar Cayce, the man. We're not going to take long on that. Many of you have read biography, and you could give a sketch, either from that biography or a TV show you've seen or an article you've read or conversations you've had with folks about him. I guess a phrase that I heard very often that sticks with me related to the man is something like, he was no saint and he was no scoundrel. Many who knew him well said, if you met this man on the street, you would never know how psychic he was and what he did for his entire life, his entire adult life. He looked like anyone else. No lightning bolts shooting from his eyes or pulsating aura or some particular sense that you would get when you were with him, including people who were with him lots, but also with people who were meeting him for the first time. Looked very commonplace. Let me mention 3 or 4 characteristics that always come up for me when I think about my grandfather. One was what a difficult life he had and how that affected him. And you have read, some of you, of some of those difficulties, but things that were tremendously stressful for him, that would be stressful for many of us. One was being thrown in jail a few times and the publicity that came with that. Thrown in jail for practicing medicine without a license, and really devastating, evidently, for him. But the pain that he felt from that. A second was financial pressures, the struggling, the ups and downs, but lots of down in terms of struggling to have enough to eat. My father talks about as a young man, as a older boy, wearing newspapers inside his clothes to keep warm, not having an overcoat, and that sort of thing. Really struggling financially, stressful. His conflict with the church, with his local church. You know how important his spiritual life was to him, reading the Bible over and over all of his life. He was a number of times asked to stop teaching Sunday school because there were conflicts between stories that the minister at his church had heard about, whether it was reincarnation or just psychic ability or whatever, and people complaining at the church and so forth, and he was asked to stay away. Really difficult for him, evidently. So there was a stressful life. That's just at the top of the list of a number of issues that affected him as a man. My father says clearly, Gladys says clearly. Another part of him that many people don't talk about so much, but that my father talked about a good deal with me, was his sort of introversion, extroversion struggle. There were, many of us have seen lots of pictures of lots of people around his dinner table, and that was fairly commonplace, and yet either the stresses from working with his psychic ability or just his innate nature of needing alone time, there was the pull to be alone. And there was a source of sustenance for him in fishing, as John was joking about this morning, but also in gardening and in woodworking, as James mentioned. He made pieces of furniture. My mother told a story to our family that I'm sure has never been published, but my father was in the war in the early 40s when There Is a River, the book that introduced many of you to the work of Edgar Cayce, was published, and the crates of the book came to Edgar Cayce's home. It was announced ahead of time that they were coming. He knew they were coming, and there was a party of people, his friends from Norfolk, Virginia, and Virginia Beach, and a group of people, close friends, but also associates and family, who were there for the opening of these wooden crates of books, 3 or 4 crates of copies, hardback copies of There Is a River. And my mother, who I was a baby at the time, who had me with her and was at this party, said that she asked Edgar Cayce's wife, Gertrude, where he was, and she said, he's outside, he's out back, go and get him, Sally, my mother. and my mother took me out to his shop beside the garage in the house where they lived, and he was out there pulling the empty wooden crates apart, making them into kindling for the fire, for the fireplace. And he was saying, you know, this kindling will work great, and we don't really have the money for a load of coal, which they used right this week. And so that's why I'm doing that now. But my mother felt that he really wanted to be out there alone and to think about this book coming out and the implications of that and so forth. Again, lots of stories about that, which we all work with, that introversion, extroversion aspect. One more little glimpse of the man. James was chuckling about this yesterday in his talk, but evidently my grandfather loved all sorts of Southern food and loved my grandmother's cooking. And his readings over and over were very explicit, readings for himself about the importance of being careful with his diet, that would help with the accuracy and the clarity of his psychic ability. And yet he would regularly choose to disregard that information. There was a restaurant, a small seafood restaurant that he and his wife could walk to up the Atlantic Avenue from where he lived a couple of blocks, and they made a seafood stew that he loved. And my mother said that he would argue with his wife until they would both get mad, and she would eventually give in, and they would go and eat this rich seafood stew, he would, and then he would get sick. He would feel, I don't know how sick, but feel under the weather. And this might last for several days. His favorite food was fried pork chops in greens that his wife would cook, and he would urge her to cook them, even though his readings said that for him and for many of us, pork was difficult to digest, more difficult than other meats. So he struggled with appetites the way we all do, but evidently really struggled with his in himself. Well, let me give you, we could go on with those characteristics. You get the idea. Very much like you and me in the sense of working with the real world in his physical body, with his relationships and his appetites and so forth. I wrote down from my notes, I would ask people over and over, what do you think were his strengths, his most positive, clearest qualities? And I think many of you would list these quickly, but over and over, his honesty and sincerity. He was down to earth, not aloof. There was a deep, deep commitment to service. Let me say one more. Now, the little story or two, and we're going to leave this Edgar Cayce, the man. And you can come back to it a little bit with questions if you want, but I would encourage you, if you haven't read a biography, especially this latest one by Sidney Kirkpatrick, and some of you are carrying around the copy of There is a River, and there's Jess Stearns, The Sleeping Prophet, and so forth, a number of really good biographies that describe the man in some detail, his whole life, really, childhood and so forth. There's a story that I first heard from my father about his younger brother. It was one of these dinner tables of 10 or 12 or more people around, and my uncle, my father's younger brother, was very young, 6 years old, something like that, at the table. He had probably been at this kind of setting over and over again and was bored and tired, and he suddenly screamed out as the conversation was going on. He was in his high chair or whatever, looking out the picture window, and he said, "There's a lion out there in the front yard. I see a lion." And the conversation stopped, and people looked, and there was no lion. Nobody saw a lion. And he said a couple of other times in a loud voice, interrupting people, "There was a lion out there." And my grandfather began to say to his young son, "Quiet down, Ekin." They called him Ekin. His name was named for his father. Edgar Evans, his father, grew up to be a very bright electrical engineer. His reading said from Atlantis, and in any case, this was an attention-getting 5-year-old, and his father spoke sternly to him and said, "Stop, Ekin." And Edgar Evans continued, "I see a lion. I saw a lion out there. Didn't anybody else see that lion?" And so forth. And finally, he was sent to his room, and the dinner ended. My grandfather, Edgar Cayce, was still angry with his son, and went up and scolded him, and after the dinner was over, and said, "I really should have made you come down and apologize to the guests at dinner for telling such a lie. I want you to apologize to your mother and me now for telling such a lie." And my father said, Edgar Evans said, this 5-year-old, "Oh, I saw a lion out there. I'm not going to say I'm sorry." And my grandfather lost his temper with his son, dragged him down the stairs, and stood him in the corner of the dining room and said, "You're going to stand right there until you come upstairs and apologize to your mother and me for saying what you did at dinner." And hours went by, and my grandmother came down and checked on him, and my father came down and checked, and he was still standing in the corner. My grandmother came down and put a chair there, and so he sat in the corner. My grandfather came down several times, asked him if he was ready to say he was sorry, and that he didn't really see a lion, and he said no. And finally, late at night, my grandmother got my grandfather, Edgar Cayce, to come down. He said, "He has to go to bed. You know, you all have to make peace and can work it out tomorrow." And Edgar Cayce went down and sat on the floor beside Edgar Evans, the 5-year-old, and said, "Let's just pray about this a minute and see what God says about our situation." And they prayed silently for a few minutes, and then Edgar Cayce asked his son, "Did God say anything to you?" And Edgar Evans looked his father straight in the eye and said, "God said when he first saw that dog, he thought it was a lion too." Now, what my father told me about this was that this was as high-powered a family crisis as it was going on. People losing their tempers, screaming at each other. I mean, most of us, I think, have had that kind of thing in our family. This was not, this happened in the Cayce family also. And yet later, my father said that my grandfather used to love to tell that story and laugh about it. So he got over it, you know, and anyway, very much a typical family in lots of ways, I think. All right, enough about the man. I think John mentioned earlier, or maybe James, you know, he would lose his temper. There are several books written by people who knew him well. One written with Gladys, his secretary, and in that she talks about, and at our dinner table many times, she would talk about him getting angry with her and throwing papers down on her desk and so forth. And she said, I mean, she was very gentle and so supportive of her boss, this dear friend from many lifetimes, she said that usually when he would lose his temper with her or with others, he was not feeling well, that there was a tendency for either because of his eating or because of stress in his life, perhaps from these sorts of stresses that we've just referred to, he would get a cold that would get worse and worse and stick in his chest and go on for months. And he would get more and more depleted, and then would have to stop giving readings for a while. And there would be these emotional outbursts and so forth. John used the term a man of extremes. And I've heard many close to my grandfather use that sort of phrase, extreme. Edgar Cayce's psychic ability, the process. What are the causal factors? How does it work? You know, I put on my psychologist hat for a minute and you know, recall the psychology texts that say we are a product of our environment and heredity. That's certainly the case in part, maybe in small part, but in part for Edgar Cayce. There are stories, particularly focus in Sid Kirkpatrick's latest book about him being hit with a baseball at an early age, hit in the head or the spine or both, a fairly serious illness, and that the psychic ability was more intense or different or after that. There were stories about that. I mean, that's a kind of environmental thing where the physical environment literally might play a part. I don't think that's clear at all, that this was a key factor from the stories I've heard and tried to read related to this. But the environment also included a family, a mother, and a grandfather who were very open to this psychic ability of this young boy at an early age, and that's certainly not always the case. The minister in their little church was open to it and understanding. That is often a factor these days. As I've worked, we'll touch on this a little later, but as I've worked with some children with a tremendous amount of psychic ability, still in this time there are major issues there in terms of openness and support of the people in the immediate environment. You know, an aside here, in my reading from Edgar Cayce, given when I was 4 hours old, that just jolted me. You know, I didn't read it until I was 11 or 12. That seems very strange. I mean, I'd already been going to lectures, just going up and sitting with it was people visiting our home, or mainly folks interested in the work of Edgar Cayce. And yet I just, I wasn't sure about it and wasn't interested especially, and then got interested as people began to tease me a little about my strange family. My father sat me in a room, it's another story, and I read all of his readings, my mother's readings, and my younger brother did not have readings, and my readings, this life reading and 4 or 5 physical readings that were given before he died when I was almost 3. And some of the stuff in there had already, I mean, I had this feeling of somebody knowing me almost better than I knew myself. There were things that could not have been controlled by my family and so forth that had already happened in my life that were in this reading. But one of the things in there was typical in that it mentioned, as John was mentioning this morning, family groupings, having as a soul been with some of these family members before. And one of those situations was described, it's described not with my name, but in There Is a River, where a grandfather of Edgar Cayce's that had psychic ability lots of stories about him, according to my reading, was a past life of mine. And this grandfather had this little boy, Edgar Cayce, on a horse riding in the woods near their farm to a pond, and the horse reared and threw the little boy off, Edgar Cayce, on the bank, and ran into the pond. The grandfather fell off, caught his feet in the stirrups, and died there. The little boy, Edgar Cayce, watched that happen and supposedly spoke with the grandfather, the dead grandfather, communicated with him often after that for some period of time. So Edgar Cayce was in a family with this grandfather and the mother and the minister and so forth that was open to the grandfather having psychic ability and generally supportive of this sort of thing. So there was an environment that was somewhat encouraging, very close to him. And the hereditary factor with the grandfather, perhaps, was there. But the big one that's focused on in the Cayce readings has to do with past lives, and many of you have read about that. Number of readings for himself, asking about why he had so much psychic ability and how it worked and so forth. And let me touch on that a little bit. He talked about two past lives that I've tried to look at and think about carefully. One, of course, to do with high priest in ancient Egypt, where he developed and taught some of these sorts of abilities. These abilities were a part of the process of the people at that time. People around him, and him especially as a priest, had this ability, and it was carried over into this lifetime. A little more recently, but still in ancient times, talking about dying slowly on an ancient battlefield, where he, over a period of many hours, developed the ability to remove himself from his physical body as the physical body went through this painful death. And that sort of removed that separation of the spirit self from the physical body was part of what was carried over into this lifetime as Edgar Cayce. So there was really, in terms of causes, there is heredity, I think there are environmental factors, but there is this added past life factor that was a clear part of the Cayce readings. For me, with my psychologist hat on, I was startled and excited by the concept in the readings that's not so new now, but the idea that psychic ability is normally distributed in the population, just like musical ability or athletic ability, that there are a few people, you know, the old normal curve, a few people in every generation who are born with a tremendous amount of the ability to play the piano or an athletic ability or whatever. Much larger number of us with some practice can learn to play the piano a little bit or learn to run a little faster or whatever. And then there are a few people at the tail end of that normal curve. And that Edgar Cayce, this entity that we're talking about this afternoon, was way out at the tail end of this normal distribution, but for that, in that generation. But that there was a reading talking about this that said quickly, and there are others in this generation with as great or greater ability as the entity who's giving the readings here. And then he went on to give some names. They were fairly common names. I think the people who, one of them I know, the little group that heard that reading had their hands full with Edgar Cayce. They did not, you know, it's a shame they didn't go and look for these people or follow up with questions. Where does this person live? Because the names were fairly common names. Much later, years after Edgar Cayce's death, a little bit before he died, those attempts to track down those people, and there was no way to do that. However, the clear implication in the readings was that there are always such people I think we feel that and have a sense of that and have perhaps been in contact with some in our generation. How does it work? When this was asked over and over in the readings, a metaphor that was used, probably especially appropriate at that time, maybe if they were given today, readings given today and a metaphor used today, would be computers and televisions and so forth as the metaphor, but the radio was the metaphor that was used. And the source said that Cayce was an especially adept receiver, but that we're all transmitting and receiving all the time. And that if we want to try to understand psychic ability a little more, speaking to that generation where the radio was the thing, think about radio transmitting and receiving and tuning the channel and so forth. You know, the question immediately comes up with regard to Cayce's ability and the sources of the ability. And from my perspective, 3 sources were mentioned. That in this trance state, Edgar Cayce had access especially to the mind, the way that John used the mind this morning, not simply gray matter between the ears, but a broader, we'll go into it a little more either today or tomorrow, the reading's definition of mind, but that Cayce could tune into the mind of the person asking the questions. And especially with regard to the physical readings, he would get information of a diagnostic nature of the cause of the physical problems from the mind of the person asking the questions. And you know, in thousands, really, no exaggeration, thousands of descriptions, detailed descriptions of what was going on inside people's bodies who were asking for the readings, sometimes from thousands of miles away. A second source was having access to the minds of every being, living and dead, and beings that had not ever incarnated into the earth plane. Angelic beings, archangels, readings came through, as some of you know, identifying themselves as angels and archangels. So there was this pool of information. And third, this what the readings referred to as the Akasha, the Akashic record, in my simplistic thinking, like a giant database of every event, not just human and animal and plant actions, but every event, an earthquake in some part of the world, an event and a record. And Cayce having access to that record of every event that has ever occurred. And then in a kind of radio receiver-like fashion, or perhaps computer-like fashion, tuning in to that database and addressing the specific questions asked. Those 3 sources, I think, were most frequently mentioned, and to my sense and understanding, were the primary sources of the information. Let me digress for a moment here and tell you about a couple of children. I was in California in graduate school, Berkeley, and in Mississippi at graduate school, studying in psychology programs where you didn't even use the word mind, behavioristically oriented graduate programs. But eventually, one of the ways my father sort of lured me to the ARE to take a closer look, I was teaching at the University of Maryland in College Park, and with some unusual experiences there. But my father said that from time to time, parents brought children or wrote to the ARE about children that they had that they felt had psychic ability, and they wanted to know what to do as parents, how to deal with it. And I was fascinated by that. And over a period of a few years, That was a primary focus for me, and amazing notes and experiences. But let me just give you a little taste of that. It was clear to me, what we touched on a little earlier, from in those years working with those children, that Edgar Cayce was not unique in terms of the only human being having this kind of psychic ability at this particular time. It continues to show itself, to bubble up in interesting ways. One, let me just mention two. One, I grew up in Virginia Beach, and when I came back to work at the ARE, was still in touch with a number of friends there who were teaching in high school and the local schools there, guidance counselors, and was talking to them about their work and my background in working with children. And one of them, not related to ARE at all, a guidance counselor in a local elementary school, asked if I would talk with someone, a young girl who had been referred to her in her school, in that school. And I said, of course. The girl came in. I still remember it vividly. This was, if not the first, one of my first experiences with this sort of thing. Of course, having heard about my grandfather for many, many years. The girl came in, brought by her mother. They were a Navy family. There was conflict in the home. I mean, lots of Navy families in Virginia Beach, and the naval base there and so forth. But the mother was trying to be understanding and so forth. The father was angry and adamant that what this little girl, Phyllis, was saying was crazy, and she needed to stop it, that this was going to get worse and worse. Phyllis was saying that she was in regular touch with a little boy who had died suddenly, a little boy her same age, 10, I think, or 9, that he was telling her about what it was like there, where he was, and she had begun to tell friends at school and had told her teacher about this little boy who was dead and who had died recently and so forth. I'm sure I was born into this family partly because there is a gene of skepticism in me. I have heard so many exaggerated stories, psychic stories and so forth, you know. This little girl said her friend's name was Phyllis. I mean, her name was Phyllis, her friend's name was Phil. I thought, wait a minute, you know, that's just... And so we talked a little more, and she was very serious and convincing and didn't seem emotionally disturbed at all, except upset about her father's upset. I just, on the spur of the moment, went down the hall. My office was in the old hospital building there at the ARE headquarters, and there was an elderly man working in an office down the hall. This fellow was working on a booklet on material in the Cayce readings. Older man. I looked at him, and there were a couple of books on his desk, and one was a dictionary with over 800 pages in it. I pulled the dictionary over from his desk, and I opened it upside down without looking at the pages and put it down face down on his desk and said, "Worth, please don't look at it until I come back." And I went back to Phyllis and said, "Phyllis, can you talk to Phil now?" She cocked her head a little bit and said, "Yeah, sure." And I said, "Well, ask him if he could do this, if he could go down the hall to room 208 and tell us the page number of the book that's open on the desk there." And she closed her eyes and cocked her head again and gave a number, a 3-digit number, fairly quick. She gave the number. I moved quick. I jumped out of my seat, ran down the hall, and turned the book over, and it was open to that page. We did that 10 times. She never missed. And then I began to get serious with her and talk with her about who this was and so forth, and corroborated that a little boy by that name had died, not in this area, but in the New Jersey area and so forth, made records of that. Well, the point of this was that She did not continue to work with the ability, even though that next summer she went to the ARE Children's Camp, which we have set up partly for the purpose of having a supportive environment for talking about and these kinds of experiences and so forth. She didn't continue. Her father, I met with the mother and father. Her father was just absolutely angry at the mention of this sort of thing, at the possibility that this sort of thing could happen, and that it was superstition and so forth and so forth. And the mother said, we need to talk with Phyllis about not talking about this. Let me tell you one more, quick one. A little girl by the name of Mary, who was 11, I guess, when I first met her. Her mother wrote to the ARE. Mary had begun to show psychic ability with her friends in the neighborhood, and they would tell stories about her finding lost objects and that sort of thing. And the mother tried this with Mary by herself. This was she had 9 brothers and sisters, Mary did. It's a large Catholic family. And the mother was nervous about all of this and hid some things in the house, and Mary found them, thought about it and found them. Some neighbors suggested she contact the ARE. I went to Philadelphia and talked to Mary and went through some sort of demonstrations with her, some little tests that just knocked my socks off. And she began to visit the ARE. We would bring her down and talk with her. I would talk with her about other children with psychic ability, and there was a little group of children there in Virginia Beach who met to talk about this sort of thing, and she sat in on that group a little bit. And then this thing happened. James was talking yesterday, we talk about objects having energy, stones and so forth, and of course places having energy. And to the parapsychologist, there's a whole study of that called psychometry, related to specific energy associated with specific objects. And we did this study with her several times related to psychometry. The first time I did it, I collected 20 objects, personal objects, from people on the staff at the ARE. Man put a wedding ring in and so forth. The objects were collected by my secretary. I didn't know who had put what objects in, or even which people had put objects in the box. So there were 20 objects, and when we were doing the psychometry, she would put an object up to her forehead. As we started to do this thing, which we were filming, this with the 20 objects, just before she had come into the room, I had put in my pocket before I left home a pair of old eyeglasses of mine. And I no longer wore eyeglasses. She had certainly never seen them. She reached in the box and pulled out the eyeglasses and put them on against her head, and she said, oh my goodness, these are yours, Charles Thomas. And then she went through all 20 objects. Later, while we worked with her at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, she said under hypnosis that this ability with her hands, energy that she said moved through her hands especially, could also be directed out, not only collected from objects and places, but directed out, and that she could touch and pray for people and help them. We did that a little bit with people at the ARE in Virginia Beach, and then we did a study at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia with complex but fascinating positive results. The children, 6 with tremendous amounts of psychic ability, 10 with a lot of psychic ability. None of those 10 children, 8 of them girls, 2 boys, none of them are working with their ability now. They all stopped working with their ability as they moved into puberty. The Cayce readings suggest, as John was touching on this morning, that energy, including psychic energy, moves through these endocrine centers, through these psychic centers for which there are concomitant centers of energy in our finer body. What the Cayce readings talked about is the finer body or the mental body, this orb. Several of the children that I worked with who saw auras in the Virginia Beach area where there is the headquarters for Planters Peanuts, talked about this body that they saw, this energy body, as our peanut body. As energy moves through these endocrine centers at the time of puberty, there is evidently a disruption. Or we all know that that's a sensitive time for children, and even younger and older. It's not a great thing usually to be different, and especially with regard to an ability that people laugh about sometimes, or are critical about, or question whether it really exists. A telling detail, I think, both about our society and about situations that we need to help children move through this period. I'm not sure where we would be. An exciting place if any of these children were, with the amount of ability that I saw, had been able to move through this period of time. Mary, the little girl who worked at the Children's Hospital, was also from a Catholic family, but this mother went to her priest to ask what was going on with Mary. He immediately said, "This is the work of the devil. You need to stop it immediately." Terrified the mother. So the culture, even these days, 50 years after Edgar Cayce, we struggle with our cultural acceptance of this sort of thing, related to psychic ability and trying to better understand psychic ability that's a part of all of us. But it's clearly spelled out in the Cayce readings that if we will practice it, as we would practice the piano or any other discipline that we want to learn, any other ability that we want to improve, we can fairly quickly, and there are exercises suggested in the readings, fairly quickly get in closer touch with and become more adept with our psychic ability, all of us. When I was much younger, researchers, parapsychologists, some psychiatrists visited our home and tested me to see if I'd inherited any of my grandfather's psychic ability. Visited, of course, with my parents' permission. I was taken to the laboratories of J.B. Rhine, who was a famous parapsychologist, a laboratory set up at Duke University, books published by Rhine, parapsychological journal started by his researchers that continues to exist, and that research continues. Really some of the pioneering research in the field of parapsychology. And this study was done on me. The early 50s, I guess, I was asked at the lab to write down 5 first names of people that I was very close to, names that were emotionally charged for me. Remember, one of the names I wrote down was my mother's name, Sally, and 4 others. And then they asked me to write down 5 first names that were meaningless to me. I didn't know anybody by those names, had no associations for me. So I had 10 names. Then I was attached to a device called a plethysmograph, wires coming from it that measured blood volume in my finger. And those wires went to a machine that recorded blood volume changes in my finger, machine in another room. And then I was asked to sit quietly in one room. There was someone else in another room who had the list of names and who would randomly select one of the 10 names and focus on that name and try to send it to me. A record of the blood volume in my finger was recorded. And this went on for quite a while. The concentration, as I recall, was for 30 seconds, and then there was a pause of 30 seconds when he was not concentrating on any name, and then would pick another name to concentrate on. This went on for quite a while. And then the experiment ended. They brought the record, the tape ink record of blood volume changes in my finger, and the record that the man had kept of when he had concentrated on which name, and you could match that across and just write down the line whenever he concentrated on a name that was emotionally charged for me, like my mother's, there was a blood volume change in my finger. Really interesting, I think, an exciting part of this study is that this has been done hundreds and hundreds, I'm sure thousands of times now, replicated with many, many people with the same results. The Cayce readings suggest, and as a psychologist, I would quickly agree that most of us work hard to filter out. We don't want other people to know what we're thinking and what we're feeling. Of course we don't. But we have built great filters over lifetimes, probably, certainly many years in this lifetime. And yet at a deeper level, not only is it those emotionally charged names, but as James was doing with us just a little while ago, as we send positive energy to situations and we put energy into that, I mean, there is just clear parapsychological evidence that this kind of thing can connect us with each other and that we can direct it, both as senders or transmitters and as receivers. I'm going to stop right there this evening. We're going to talk just a little more tomorrow, begin with a little more on Edgar Cayce's psychic ability and the ramifications for us and how we can work with it, and then work with 4 or 5 content areas from the readings with some stories, personal stories of mine, content areas that have been especially helpful and meaningful to me, and hopefully can provide a little nudge and insight for you to perhaps choose one or more of these to work with as we leave this weekend, or work a little more with as we leave this weekend. Again, it's just great to be with you. Thank you. James?